Right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy that today we have Branko Milanovic presenting. Branko is a visiting presidential professor here at the City University of New York at the Graduate Center. He's also a senior scholar at the Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality on the 6th floor of the building, when the building will reopen after the coronavirus. His PhD is in economics in 1987 from the University of Belgrade. His dissertation is about income inequality in Yugoslavia, and as we know, with all the changes and so on, he still works on this important area, well known in the area of inequality. He served as a lead economist in the World Bank Research Department for almost 20 years. He wrote his book in 2005, World Apart. This is one of the reasons that he left the World Bank, to write about global income inequality. He has held a teaching appointment at the University of Maryland, Johns Hopkins, visiting scholar at Oxford and in Madrid. His main area of work, as we all know, is income inequality, both in individual countries and globally, including pre-industrial societies and going until today, as we will hear in a minute. Published many articles in the Economic Journal, Review of Economics and Statistics, Journal of Economic Literature, Journal of Development Economics, Journal of Political Philosophy, and others. Among his books that I want to mention today are The Haves and the Have-Nots from 2011, is a book about global inequality from 2016, which was translated or has been translated to 16 languages. He's well known in introducing the concept of Kuznets waves, successive Kuznets waves in inequality. He got many prizes. One of them is the Leontief Prize for advancing the frontiers of economic knowledge. His recent book from 2019 is Capitalism Alone. As far as non-professional interest, some of you know that in Europe they care very much about soccer. Branko is also interested in Roman history, in the second and the fourth AD, and then in Second World War II. And as far as languages, he's fluent in English, French, of course, Serbo-Croatian, and he's reasonably fluent in Russian and Spanish, and beginners in Polish, which again shows the influence of the European studies versus our American inability to communicate in different languages. So Branko, I'm very happy that you are here, and let me give the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Johanan. This is a very, impressive introduction. I'm very grateful to you for this. And of course, I'm extremely grateful to you for the invitation, because it is, of course, a pleasure. And obviously, I know quite a few people here. From some of them were my students, some of them actually colleagues, and some of them both students and colleagues. And of course, it is a pleasure to be at the Graduate Center, even if virtually. Of course, I'm there like every week because the classes are still going on, but this is a little bit special. So let me go. Let me just first see if you can see well the PowerPoint. Can you see it now? Can you see the PowerPoint?
Not yet.
Okay, let me try to get it. For some reason we were able. Can you see it now?
No, you just need to share screen again.
Yes, I know. Okay, this is some of my students know that this is like a permanent problem that actually I experienced it. Okay.
That's okay. Take your time. We are fine.
Yeah. Well, hopefully. Somehow now I cannot do anything, but.
So let me just explain to the audience that because we have this announcement about recording, we need to take the presentation in and out and so on.
Also, that was the reason? Well, no. Okay, so let me try. Okay, I think I'm now back to work.
It's okay.
Can you see it now? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Excellent.
Okay, I'm glad. It's always like a challenge. So let me, I would speak for, I hope, about 35 minutes or so. I have heard, Caroline mention, I'm not exactly sure what the rules, but maybe you can send questions in writing. And of course, we will have Q&A at the end, but I was wondering if some of you might have a very pressing question during the presentation. Or maybe you can raise your hand, or we'll see. So let me keep on going. As the title says, I would really talk about the current and long-term, actually, evolution of global income inequality and its political meaning. One thing that I hope to convey in this talk is the fact that also when we talk about, when we talk about global inequality, we are also talking to a large extent about the history of the world, essentially, economic history of the world, because global inequality, by definition, is the inequality between incomes of all citizens of the world. So you basically, I will explain a little bit later how we do it, but basically the idea is you take somehow from household surveys, or sometimes with fiscal data, income of people around the world. You then convert that using purchasing power parity, or international dollars, into comparable dollars, so that you can compare income of people in India with income in Australia or elsewhere, and then you calculate some measure. But obviously you can do many things. I'll show you some of them. But one has to keep in mind that what you really are doing at some level, you're really charting the history, economic history of the world. And I think in some sense, we are only at the beginning of that task, because the more we know, the more we will be able to do that. Because when you go back to like 1950s or even 1820s and look at how inequality between between citizens of the world was then compared to today, you're doing nothing else but basically, as I said, looking at the periods of great divergence, or more recently convergence of incomes between Asia and Europe and so forth. So let me briefly say something about the structure of the talk. I will not say much about the first part, about the uniqueness of the current period. That comes also from my book, Capitalism Alone. The first point is that capitalism is the only mode of production that exists today, including in China. And the second topic, which is actually more important for this talk, is the changing structure of world incomes and the emergence of Asia. And you will see, during this talk, how that is already translated and how it will be even more translated into the global income inequalities. I will say quite a few things about the changes between 1988 and 2008. I will show you that famous elephant graph, but I've become a little bit tired of it, so I will show it only very quickly. And then I will talk about what happened after the financial crisis, including my most recent paper, which ends with 2013-14, and some speculations then about what happened since. Now, of course, it's very difficult to speculate about what will happen yet. In a most recent present, rather, with the COVID crisis, which is in many respects much more serious than the financial crisis. So let me go with the long run. It's not going to be boring, because long runs really show you the evolution, which many of us kind of maybe implicitly know, but it's better when you see it in numbers. Now, what this graph here shows you, years are on the horizontal axis, and the Gini index, the measure of inequality, is on the vertical axis. And the graph starts from 1820. It is based on Bourguignon and Morrison's famous paper, which actually charted the evolution of global inequality from 1820 to 1992. And
Branko, if I could just interrupt and ask you to show full screen by using the screen view at the bottom icon there.
Is it better now?
That's fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, great. So this is based on Bourguignon and Morrison's paper. And what I did, actually, obviously, I did the most recent part, which was not included in their paper. And I converted their numbers, which used the 1990 PPPs and 1990 Madison GDPs, into more recent version of 2017 Madison's GDPs. You know, there is not much of a difference in terms of you know, what you get. Actually, almost there is no difference at all, but simply just to make the study of Bourguignon and Morrison up to date in terms of new medicines numbers. So let's see how it looks. First of all, if you start with 1820 and then consider the entire 19th century for a minute, and you see a very, you know, strongly rising global inequality. It starts with the Gini of 55, which when you think of this is not an enormous Gini for the world, given that many countries, like suppose Colombia or Brazil, have a Gini of 55. So that's how the world was unequal in 1820. Well, then of course it became throughout the 19th century much more unequal. That was the result of the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the West. And if you want to put it in a very simple way, just for your intuition, think of the three parts of the world which will really play the key role throughout this whole period. And that's essentially the West, meaning Europe, you can say even broadly, but more precisely, Western Europe and North America on the one hand. So that would be one unit. And the other two units are India and China. So if you look at these three units, they really include, I mean, throughout this whole period, you know, about half of the world population or even sometimes more. And they also include a large chunk or about the same percentage of global income. So they really, what happens between the three of them largely determines what happens to global inequality. And somebody's asking something or? Okay, what you see there during the 19th century is you have the rise of the West, which means that the incomes in the West increase. India and China either stagnate or go down. China even goes down, and global inequality essentially goes up. On top of that, during the same period, you had rising within national inequalities. So that period is very interesting because it's a period where you have increasing divergence between the countries and you have increasing divergence within the countries. I'll come to that in a moment as well, but let's just keep this in mind. Afterwards, you have, as you can see, you have a slight decline during the World War I and the Great Depression, essentially reflecting the fact that the rich countries have had a very bad period in terms of growth. Not that much has happened in India and China or Africa. They actually remain as poor as they were before. And then you have a period of after World War II and the period of what they call the US dominance, where you basically have extremely high level of inequality. And not only do you have an extremely high level of inequality, but you have an inequality which is predominantly determined by differences in mean country incomes. I'll show you that in a second. And finally, the third period that we live now is the period of convergence, in the sense that the rise of Asia means that Asian countries, not only China, but India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, are really catching up with Western countries. So that, of course, is like a mirror image of what happened before, is that you do have now a reduction of global inequality because of the catch-up of those countries. So, you know, I would divided this period like in three, you know, sub-periods. And actually, I think it's very clear from what I said. The first period is essentially the period where you have large cleavages within nation states and divergences, is said. The second period, then I put Marx, obviously, like a sort of an exemplar of a thinker who actually, you know, studied the first period. The second period is a little bit more difficult, but I think the person who exemplifies it the best is Frantz Fanon, because of his work on the basically differences between the three worlds. And then the question is actually, how would the future look? Are we now, if we do have a convergence between the countries and we have divergence within, because we have had like last 30 years rising inequality in most of the countries, from China to the US to Russia, are we really going back to a situation where the main cleavage could be within nation states and not between? So this is really basically the question. A different way to look at this is the following. This is actually the composition which uses the tail coefficient. So it's exactly the same period from 1820 to 2013. So you see actually 200 years at 20-year intervals approximately. And the blue bar gives you the total between country inequality. So how unequal are countries in the world? Now, as many of you will immediately notice, we are a little bit there. We have several problems there. First, the number of countries has increased in the world. So obviously, if you have a greater number of countries, if more, keeping everything else the same, you would still have an increase in the between component. Secondly, we really don't, have the data for all the countries in all the years. So we have oftentimes to actually combine different countries, so make them into a region. But having said all of these problems, I think there is little doubt that the structure of global inequality, or inequality rather between the countries, looked the way that you see it here. A significant increase over the 19th century, then plateauing throughout most of the, second half of the 20th century, and then the decline more recently from the end of the 20th century until today. Actually, today's blue bar would be even lower than this bar in 2013. Notice also how low was the bar in 1820, when the gaps between the countries were relatively small. People take, for example, Netherlands versus China or Sri Lanka or Ceylon in those days as the largest gap, and that gap was about 3-1. If you were to take this largest gap today, you would probably have the ratio which would be more than 100, not probably, certainly, you would have a ratio about 150-1. So obviously the gaps between the richest and the poorest, if you take them isolated, just the top to the bottom, that gap has become much wider now. So the second bar here, the orange bar, is the bar which shows the within country inequality. Here you see actually also the rising within country inequalities in the 19th century, then sort of stagnating within countries or even declining within country inequalities in the second part of the 20th century, and then the decline of the blue bar, but not much of a change in the orange bar more recently. I would like to sort of point out these two last periods. The period of the second part of the 20th century is an interesting period because it was a period of very clear segmentation, if you will, between the three worlds. There was the first world, which was essentially the Western world. And then there was a second world, which were essentially socialist countries. And then there was the third world, which was Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And even if you do a very simple exercise, I did it with Shlomo Yitzhaki many years ago, and then divide the world into these three groups around that time, you really had relatively little overlap between the countries. So what was interesting is the structure of the world was really very special at that time. Is that if you were in the third world, you were generally almost always poorer than if you were in the second world. And if you were in the second world, you were always poorer than if you were in the first world. So that particular structure has now really disappeared. It has disappeared not only ideologically because the second world, which was socialist, no longer exists, but even if you look at the differences in income, in the sense that some countries that used to be the third world have really gone all the way to the first world. Take South Korea, that was a poor country at the same level as Ghana in the 1950s. And then other countries have also sort of declined. So in other words, the structure of the world is now very different than it was in the second half of the 20th century. So I do think actually, and keep in mind, have a look at this graph, I think really we can legitimately speak of the three ages over the last 200 years. And we can see that in what sense we are now at that third age, which is the age of convergence between the continents, mostly between Asia and the rich world, and the age of maybe increasing cleavages within nation states. I'll skip this slide, which is basically the same slide as the one in the previous graph, shows you again international inequality or inter-country population weighted inequality and inequalities within nation states. So it's basically the same story as before. Then I have a nice quote to show you what was the world at the peak of these three worlds. For people of my age, that world was the world that we were born in, and actually seemed a world that to some extent was would never go away, but it really did go away. And you notice here in this quote by Senghor, when he speaks of the haves nations and the non-haves in terms of nations. And that's precisely true for what the data, I mean, it's reflected in the data that we have now. Senghor did not have them in 1960s, but it really shows that really large cleavage which existed between the three different worlds. And that's what I said before, Frantz Fanon was my sort of a writer that exemplifies that cleavage. Now, another way to also to look at this, at the resurgent Asia, I think the term comes from Angus medicine, resurgent Asia, is to look at the three countries and their GDP per capita from medicines data, China, India, and Indonesia. I'm sort of showing them there, here against, in the case of India and China, against the GDP per capita of UK, and in the case of Indonesia, against the Dutch. So you notice here, which is actually quite striking if you look how similar these lines are. You see that at the beginning of the modern era, so 1820, just after Napoleonic Wars, you have the three countries that are about 35 to 40% of the GDP per capita of Western European countries. The percentage, the ratio of those countries toward, I mean, in respect to the West European countries is given on the vertical axis. And then you have this really an incredible slide at the decline of Asia. So much so that at the time of their independence or the revolution in China, you are basically down to a position where these countries have less than 10% of per capita income of the rich Western nations. So it was, you know, a long period of 150 years of a decline, relative decline. And then, of course, after that, you have a beginning of a recovery. And now, of course, I should really update this. The recovery is now actually every year sort of more and more present, partly because since the global financial crisis, the West has not grown very much. And on the other hand, China, Indonesia, and India have. So we are really basically back to where we were at the beginning of the 19th century in terms of relative income levels between Europe and Asia. And I will come to that in the conclusions, because I think this is a major development of not only geopolitical importance, but even very personal importance in the global distribution of income. So let me show that in another way, using again, on the other hand, Bourguignon and Morrison's data about the distributions and averages which come from Angus medicine. So let me show you that with China and the UK. So this is the graph which shows the following thing. You have on a horizontal axis percentiles in the income distribution. 10 is the first decile, 20 is the second decile, and all the way to the top decile, which is number 100. And then you have on the vertical axis percentage of income that Chinese, for example, in the bottom decile have with respect to the English in the bottom decile in 1870. So in other words, that first point, which is 40 in your graph, shows you that the poorest Chinese from the bottom decile in China had an income which was about 40% of the income of the poorest English or British people in 1870. So that they were about, you know, about a half in real terms, or less than half, 40%. But then the further you go towards richer people, you know, then you compare the second decile in China versus the second decile in the UK and so forth, you notice that actually the ratio is less. So basically throughout income distribution, the Chinese have an income which is about 20% of the British income. So just to explain this, just if it's not clear, basically what it means that the British income of a British person at the median, for example, or the 60th percentile or the 70th percentile, would be about 5 times the real income of an equivalently positioned person in the Chinese income distribution. So they're really equivalently positioned in the two distributions. So how does it then look? And that's actually striking in 1950, at the time of the Chinese Revolution. Everybody in China has become much poorer compared to the people in England. Actually, they are all now at 1/10 of the British income level. Whether you're really poor in China, you would have 1/10 of the British poor person. Whether you're rich in China, you would have 1/10 of the British rich person. And then, of course, it has then changed significantly. As you can notice, there was, of course, this is 2013, there was an improvement at every level. There was a gain at every level. And the improvement is even more substantial at the higher income levels, where, again, this is probably underestimation compared to what is today, but we are basically talking about Chinese being at income level, which is 1/3 of the British. Nevertheless, I mean, what it does show you is remarkable changes over these 2 centuries, and remarkable changes in the position of different parts of the income distribution in China versus UK. I did the same graph. I don't have time to show it here to you, but for example, when you look at the US versus UK, that's also extremely revealing, because you will then see how the period after the World War II meant that basically Americans have, compared to the equivalent Brits, have been doing really well across income distribution, even the poor people. And then you go to the most recent period, and what you notice that actually the very poor people in the US now are significantly poorer than the poor people in the UK. But the top people in the US are significantly richer. So you can actually, use these distributions to look at the changes, obviously, over time.
Branko, I have a question. Do you take into account like subsidies, like the British are giving more whatever social services relative to the US, healthcare, and so on and so on?
What is actually, that's a good question, because I didn't explain. In all the cases, actually, my income that I use is disposable income on per capita basis. Per capita meaning within the household total income is divided by the number of people who live in the household. Now, that disposable income takes into account all market income, plus all the social transfers in cash and some quasi-cash that you receive, and deducts all your direct taxation. However, it does not take into account the free benefits that you get from health or education. So it does not do that. So it really only looks at the monetary income, if you will, by deducting taxation, direct taxation. So it is not a perfect picture, because you can even say that maybe at the bottom, the Brits are actually even much better off than the Americans because of the free healthcare, for example. But that's not included. But even in the monetary terms, they are better off. It's actually very clear that West European countries are better off all the way to around the 50th percentile compared to the Americans. And then after that, the Americans take over. And at the very top, of course, the rich Americans are significantly better off.
What about distinction between urban and rural?
I will actually have that in a minute for China and India. But,
okay.
For the US and the UK, I mean, I don't really have, because, as you know, the rural population in the US is small. So I don't look at that.
Branko, follow-up question. How do you deal with property taxes and sales taxes?
No, no, indirect taxation is not included.
Okay.
Yeah. And so another way to look at what happened with China is that actually this is relatively recent period. You see that basically Chinese income distribution, this is of course the in blue, and the US income distribution. Originally, really, and if you were to go further in the past, they almost had no overlaps. Actually, I'll show you later that you have countries between Europe and Africa that almost have no overlaps in the distribution, meaning that practically everybody is in a richer country is richer than anybody in a poor country. But of course, with China, with the growth of China, there is much more of overlap now. You see here on this graph, 70% of the Chinese population is now within the US income range. So obviously US is still much richer, but they are starting to overlap. And you notice that there is much more of overlap between the blue density function, or which is actually the distribution function, and the red one. And the further China comes closer to the US, the more that overlap will be present. If you were to do the same thing, for example, let's take Germany and France, you would have the two curves already, be totally overlapping. So, the distribution and levels of income in such countries, of course, are very similar, and the overlap is almost full. A very small detail here. I just wanted to show the power of the sort of essentially looking at the world through different lenses. Many times people talk about how the world has become much better off now. You have Max Roser, who has written quite a lot, Pinker, for example, also. And it is true, if you look, and this is on this graph, the blue bar is world GDP per capita. And the red line is the coefficient of variation of the country's GDPs per capita. So the blue bar is very clear. The world has become richer. And if you read that bar on the left is the amounts, the world GDP per capita in PPP terms is now almost $15,000. And in the beginning of this period after Napoleonic Wars, it was like less than 2. So you actually have a 7-fold increase in per capita GDP. And at the same time, I'm sort of thinking maybe 7 to 8-fold increase in the population. So that kind of gives you like more than 50-fold increase in the total amount of goods and services produced. So that's something that we know, nothing really special to say there, but you notice, of course, how that blue bar has really increased very significantly after World War II. And then it's, of course, rising now very significantly, mostly because of Asia. But the red line is interesting also because it shows you the coefficient of variation between GDPs per capita of the countries. And you see that actually, if that line goes up, you have greater divergence. But you notice from around like the last years at the turn of the century, you basically have a very significant decline in that line. Essentially meaning that you have actually, it's population weighted. So essentially meaning that the populous countries like India, China, Indonesia, and so forth are really catching up with the rich world. So this is what you have in the current period. You have a continued increase in the mean per capita income and reduced divergence of population weighted GDPs per capita. But the same data, exactly the same data can be cut and looked differently. So the first part was really kind of Max Rosen optimistic view. The second part, I did it a little bit differently. I looked at GDP per capita of different countries and said, how many people, let me start with the blue slice, how many people live in countries that have the per capita income which is lower than the richest country 2 centuries ago. That was Australia then. And then it turns out you have 7% of people who live in such countries. Then you say, okay, how many people live in countries that have GDP per capita which is lower than most advanced country 1 century ago? That was the UK. And it turns out you have 33% of such people. And finally, the big chunk is like how many people live in a country that had the highest GDP per capita, that was the United States 50 years ago, and you have 45% of people. So in other words, if you look at this, you can say 33 plus 7 means 40% of the world population lives in countries whose per capita income is lower than the most advanced country 100 years ago. So, these are exactly the same data, but it shows you still how large differences are between the countries and how you still have large, sizable population of the world living in something which you might say are almost, from the income perspective, pre-modern sort of society. Now, I come to the more recent period, which is really past 30 years, which I call and it is actually the greatest reshuffle of incomes in history, because as you will see, actually, lots of people's positions have really been affected by this reshuffling, by the rise of Asia and the relative decline of the West. Now, I'm not going to read this, you know, all these really important events from 78 and the responsibility system in China to the liberalization of India. But what is actually interesting, if you read this bottom sentence, is that about 60% of the world population within 10 years practically changed the economic system under which they lived. And this is really a major revolution. And that, of course, involved the Western countries, involved the former socialist countries, involved obviously the Soviet Union, all of Eastern Europe, and involved China, and involved even India. So that was really sort of the watershed years. This is interesting to think about the present, because many people argue that the present represents some kind of similarity with that past. You know, that's something that one can discuss. I don't see such a clear-cut change nowadays compared to what we have seen then, but of course it's a matter of judgment. So what does then happen between 1988, which actually conveniently is a year first where we actually have the data from practically all the countries in the world, or at least 90+% of the world population. And that was the time which again conveniently coincides practically exactly with the end of socialism and the fall of the Berlin Wall. And in this case, 2011, how did global income inequality change? Notice the distribution in the blue line was something that looked a little bit like what Danny Qua used to call the twin peaks. You had a very significant peak at very low level of income, which was essentially Asian countries. And then you have a smaller peak at a higher level of income. You see that's about $15,000 per capita, which really had Western countries. I think there was a question, but I could...
Sorry.
Yeah, who asked a question?
I think I get it.
But
okay. There you go.
I cannot understand it. That's the problem.
Jonathan Sella, please. Jonathan Sella or Jonathan Keller? We cannot hear you.
Hi.
Okay.
Sorry about that. My question was, how are countries living in a different century measured?
Well, okay. What I explained, I said you take today's GDP per capita of different countries. You line them up, starting with poorest, like Congo or whatever. And then you say, how many people live in countries whose GDP per capita is lower than the GDP per capita of the richest country 100 years ago. The richest country, or the most developed country 100 years ago, was the UK. So UK had an income level of X. How many countries and people live in those countries that are below the level X? So that's how it is defined. So obviously I don't mean that they live like in the previous century. I just mean that they live in a country whose income level is lower than the most advanced country 100 years ago.
Oh, okay.
Branko, go ahead, student, go ahead.
Okay, so then most recent period.
No, so Branko, I have a question to you.
Yeah.
You know, an income today can go farther because I can buy computers which are more.
Yes.
So there is this advancement that with $1 today you can buy much more than what a person could have bought.
You know, well, that's a difficult question. Actually, you know, I'm not saying that they are now today exactly the same level of income as in the past, or welfare. I mean, obviously people live longer today than they did in the past. But PPPs, the problem with PPPs is that they are, strictly speaking, non-transitive in time, because they are not actually, in order to be transitive in time, they should be taken every year. And obviously, when you talk about PPPs from 1820 and today, you're making a huge amount of assumptions. So my point was not necessarily that they are actually worse off. I'm just saying that nevertheless, we do have 40% of the world population living in something which is, which are countries that are significantly behind. In other words, they are certainly significantly behind if their mean income is not even at the level of UK of 1920. So that's the idea,
Right. So it's relative position.
Yeah.
Yes.
So anyway, so that's the idea. That idea actually, if one contests that, one then actually also has to see whether that optimistic picture that I showed you first is true, because that optimistic picture is really based on exactly the same data as the pessimistic one. Okay, so nevertheless, let's go to the more recent period. What you notice here in 2011, you have, and this is actually the major change, you have a much thicker distribution, world distribution in the middle. That's really the biggest development, is that you have the emergence of something which, I'm reluctant to call the global middle class, because these people are not middle class by any Western standard, but they are in the middle of the global income distribution. And that middle of the global income distribution has become thicker. So that's really the major development. And the other way to see that actually is this, famous elephant graph, which actually shows you on the horizontal axis positions in the percentile of the global income distribution in 1988. And then it tells you what was the increase in real income over the next 20 years. And of course, that has been discussed a lot, so I would be very brief on this. So many people know it. The basic story is that around the middle of the income distribution, and that's why you had this really sort of thickening of the middle, you have had lots of people, that's about 30% of the world population, that had significant real income gains. These are, of course, they are here averaged again around, averaged across percentiles or deciles of different countries. But and you can see that's about 80% on average, the gain over the 20 years. But if you look at individual deciles, like China or India or Indonesia or Vietnam, they have increased by twice or three times. So actually the gains are sometimes 200%, 300%. So much more even than what you see on this graph. And then, of course, the reason why this graph has attracted so much attention is that you have people who are relatively well off in the global income distribution. They're around 80th percentile. So they're part of the top 20 percentile worldwide, but they really had very sluggish or no growth. And for simplicity, I call them the US lower middle class. But in reality, if you break them, 70% of the people in that group with very sluggish growth were people from the rich OECD countries, even excluding East European countries that became members of OECD. So really, we are really talking about the bottom part of the income distribution of the rich world. And three countries in particular stand out because of their size. US, really very, very mediocre performance on the bottom. Germany, likewise, very low growth in the bottom. And when I say bottom, I mean like half of the population, 50% of the population, and Japan. And if you look at all of them, you have there, right there, you have 500 million people. And if you take the bottom part of the distribution, it's 250 million people. So these are really significant numbers. And of course, the last point in this graph was a very significant growth rate at the top 1%, which of course means that in absolute terms, the gains at the top have been like many times, the order of magnitude larger than the gains anywhere else, because these people at the very top, they entered the distribution with much, much higher incomes. And then obviously, if they have a growth rate of 70%, in absolute terms, they have gained much more. So keep in mind this graph, which maybe you already know, and you would see then how things have changed after the financial crisis. So this is exactly the same graph with global income percentiles on the horizontal axis and cumulative growth now over 5 years only. So this graph comes in two, and actually has many flavors in my book, but I chose only two. One is when the blue line, where you just take a household survey data unadjusted, and the orange line is where you try to adjust for the underestimation at the top 10%. So the basic story, as you can see, it's unchanged. And when you compare the story with the previous 20-year period, you do notice two similarities and one difference. The similarity, number one, is that the middle of the income distribution, which is again Asia, has continued growing very fast. Now, that middle gradually is moving towards the higher percentiles. So, you know, this graph is not going to look, if Asia continues growing, this graph is not going to look alike continuously like this, because the Asian distribution would move not in, they wouldn't be no longer in the 50th, 60th percentile, they would become 70th or 80th percentile. So the shape of the graph will change. So don't be sort of only focused on the shape of the graph, although for the time being, of course, I'm still, talking about the shape. And then notice absence of growth again at relatively high percentiles, which are again European and North American percentiles. But the difference is that at the very, very top, the top 1 or the top 5%, you really do not have that uptick, very strong uptick, which you had between 1988 and 2008. So that has changed after the crisis. We see that very clearly in most rich countries. I'm not showing them today, but I have data from Luxembourg Income Study showing that for US in particular, the US top of income distribution has really not recovered until 2013 from the losses of the financial crisis. It could well be, and this is something that I don't have the data yet, it could well be that this sort of upswing at the top actually took place after 2013 until 2018. So that's the possibility that we might have some kind of elephant-looking slide again, but I'm not quite sure. I think that this particular pattern is unlikely to be repeated, presently, or at least in the near future. So basically, we have continued very strong growth around the global median. We had no improvement for the Western middle classes, really still very sort of modest growth. And we have a slowdown of growth of the global top 1%. So that's basically the effect of the global financial crisis.
Professor Milanovic,
yes. Yeah.
Which proportion of the total world population are these two graphs encompassing?
Oh, they are both more than 90%. We are talking, the data that I have, 2008, 2013, are really the best data that I think, much better data than we had in the past. Because, and I didn't go into the data are here all at first micro level from individual countries, and then they are being transformed into percentiles by countries. So I can tell you income of the 65th percentile of Zambia, or income of the 35th percentile of Albania, or income of the 42nd percentile of Venezuela. So this actually is extremely rich in that sense. And we didn't have, when Christoph Lackner and I did this previous graph that I mentioned you, the elephant, because of the data in 1988, which were not that rich, we actually had to work with countries with actually deciles. And only at the top, we had the top 1% and the top 4%, 5 rather in total. But now we have really much, much better data. So they really include 90, in terms of total income, 96%, I believe, and in terms of population, 94, 95. So practically everybody is included, except the countries that really, are at wars, and Libya is not included, Syria is not included, South Sudan is not included. So the countries that really do not have, North Korea, obviously.
Right, we are talking about 130 countries.
Yes, that's about 130 countries, exactly. So, when you look at absolute income, gains, then of course, this is this really amazing graph, the same graph that you saw in relative terms, where you see that actually gains at the middle. Now, when you look at that in absolute terms, of course, it is being dwarfed by, in terms partly of a graph, because it's like that, it's by the gains at the very top. So which actually is not surprising. I often don't even show that because the world income inequality is so huge that if you were to actually show absolute gains or you want to show absolute differences in income, you really almost cannot show it. You need to have a log scale in order for this to be shown on a graph. Otherwise, you really will need to, like, I don't know, take a huge poster and then have the rich people or their gains really at the very, very top. And everything else is going to be like, as you can see on this graph, is going to look like really sort of nothing. But obviously, in percentage terms, the picture is quite different.
Branko, I have a question to you about this. What about black market? Do you have any?
Okay, that's a good question. Informal sector and the black market. Yes, you have household surveys. We don't ask in household surveys, is your income legitimate or not? We actually are keen very much to get bribery, to get black market, to get anything. But to be quite honest, people don't tell you that. So, you know, I don't think that we get much of that. We get informal sector because particularly in Latin America, informal sector wages are very important. And I think we get them because our wage coverage by household sectors is almost like 100%. It's almost the same as the coverage from the national accounts. Our coverage of capital income is not very good, and particularly for the top 1%. So that's where the major issue is the miscapturing of capital incomes at the top 1%. And it's true that probably some bribery or illegal incomes we don't get. Probably people don't tell you. But now let me tell you how the world income distribution looks like. Sort of to give you an idea. This is the world income distribution. It's in log terms, so you see it almost looks log normal. It is really a big change because in the past, because of the two twin peaks, the distribution really did not look anything close to log normal. Now it does. So we have about 10% of this is before COVID and everything else, about 10% of the world population below what is basically the World Bank absolute poverty line of about $600 per year. The poverty line is $1.9 per day. So you have about 10% of people below that absolute poverty line. Then you look at the median. The median income is very modest, as you can see, it's $2,600 per capita. That includes, of course, children and everybody else. I take the income of the household divided by the number of people, but as you can see, it is a pretty modest level of income. Then you have the mean, which obviously in a asymmetric distribution is always higher than the median, and the mean is at the 73rd percentile. So that's also important to realize when we speak of the global, for example, GDP going up by X, we are really saying, unless there is a change in the distribution, we are really saying that the income at the mean has gone up by so much, which is the 73rd percentile. It's quite high in the income distribution, because it's very asymmetric income distribution. And then finally, where the rich countries, Western European, North America, and Oceania, where do they fit? They are basically the median of those rich countries is at the 91st percentile. So what is interesting, and this is what I will finish in a minute with that, is that over the last 2 centuries, Western countries had almost the entire distribution being in the top 20% of the global income distribution. So whatever we have a fight, for example, about income distribution in the US or in Western Europe, it's really a fight amongst, really from the global perspective, rich people. Because even the poor Americans are around 65th or 70th percentile of the global income distribution. But that's going to significantly change, and it's already has changed with the entry of Asian populations into those groups. So in terms of your position in income distribution, rich countries will become much more diverse because they would have top 1%ers. They would have people, from the 90 percentile globally, but for the first time in 2 centuries, they will have people also who may have an income which is equal to the global median. And I think this is actually a big development that we are witnessing now. And that's why I called it the big reshuffling, because what reshuffling does, think of this like you put like 100 cards, okay? And then you have at the top 20 cards, you basically have Western population. What happens with the rise of Asia is that these cards that were like 20 top cards, well, they would have to go back in the pile lower. They would be in the 60th percentile or 55th percentile or maybe even 40th percentile. And the Asian cards would go up into that part of the deck, which is, you know, the top 20 cards. So that would be, and that is actually a huge reshuffling. If you look, for example, another way, you look at the Chinese, I don't remember whether you use the third or fourth or fifth decile, which doesn't really make any difference. And then you look at their position in 1988 and their position today. They would have actually leapfrogged over almost 2 billion people. In other words, they were at the point where they were better off than, let's suppose, 700 million people. But if you stay at that same position in China, 20 years later, you will be better off than 2.7 billion people. So this is a major reshuffling in relative income positions. And that's why I said, I think it has no precedent except possibly for, well, except for the Industrial Revolution. So basically we have these two big events, the Industrial Revolution then, and the Asian sort of catch up and the, you know, technological revolution now. So this is the same story. You see, actually, this is the more recent period of the, you know, obviously Asia, I mean, having higher growth rates, and I will skip that because this is something which quite is well known. I'm looking at the growth rates of these different countries from the surveys and from national accounts. And then I finally give you like the composition of the global top 1%, which is still, of course, dominated by rich countries, but it is changing. The US, that's an interesting sort of a data point to know. US still has about 50% of people in the global top 1%. In other words, American citizens represent 1/2 of the global top 1%. This is about, as you can see here, the more than 30 million Americans are in the 31.6 million are in the global top 1%. And then other countries which are significant are Japan with 3.8 million, China 3.6, Germany 3.3, and so forth. So you see that actually, you know, obviously China is already playing a bigger role, of course, not as big a role as the US, but it's playing sort of a much more important role even in the global top 1%. And I think I should then
Professor
finish.
Milanovic,
Yes,
can
yes.
we go back 2 slides?
Yes, which one do you want to see?
Nope, forward 1. Oh, the top 1% slide.
This one, the top one, yes, yeah.
I don't know that there are any perfect estimates of this, but like I've heard that the number of Chinese billionaires is like 800 and the US is like 600. I mean, I'm surprised. I guess I'm surprised China is so low in this particular.
Well, you know, billionaire, I mean, this is a different story. That's actually, first, it is wealth. This is income. Secondly, okay. The billionaires are one story. I know that actually China, I think, has, as you mentioned, more billionaires, but China still does not have at the very top as many people as the US. I mean, in the top 1% or top 5%. It is getting there, but, you know, one should not sort of be overly, how should I say, exaggerate that, because China is still, in terms of mean income, significantly poorer than the US. It's 1/3 of the mean income. Income inequality in China is greater than the US. And that, of course, accounts for the fact that actually you would have people in China who are in the top 1%. But the fact that actually China is now at the same number in terms of people like Japan, I think it's a development which I don't have this graph for the previous years, but it was certainly not there. And it could change, you know, it could actually, this is, if you look at this, it represents about 5% of the total population in the top 1%, but it could easily go to 10, but, you know, so it is, it's a different metric.
Okay, thank you.
So let me then show you, I think maybe it will be the last slide. and then I'll open for Q&A. It's a very cool slide that I always like to show to give you an idea where different countries stand, not countries, but different parts of the income distribution of different countries are in the global income distribution. Start with the US. So this is the graph which shows you on the horizontal axis your position in your own country's distribution, and in the vertical axis your position in the global. So let's suppose you're a median person in the US with a median income, which I think it is about per capita $16,000 or $18,000. And then you say, okay, you got this median guy. Now it's really election time. You bring this median guy and say, okay, you median guy, where do you think are you in the global income distribution? Do you think you're above the median, below the median, exactly the median, whatever? You know, most people will tell you, yes, I'm above the median because they know I live in the United States. The United States is a rich country. And if I'm median here, I have to be higher than the median in the world. And this is indeed true. If you take this red line, which is at 50, and sort of drive it all the way to the top, where does it intersect with the US line? It shows you that the US median person would be above the 90th global percentile. So the US median guy would be in the top 10% by worldwide income. And then the very poorest people in the second or third US percentile, on the left, they would be around the 60th world percentile. So you see the entire US distribution is taking place only within top 40% of the world population. And then notice at the very top, which may not be, I wish I could have shown that somehow more easily, but notice at the very top, you have about 11 to 12%, depending on the year, of Americans who are in the top 1%. That's what we have just seen in the previous graph. So, you know, you can say, well, I'm not top 1%er, like, you know, I'm demonstrating also against top 1%, but you can't be top 1% globally. You know, even if you're not top 1% in the US, you can be actually, you know, at the 90th percentile of the US and still be in the top 1% in the world. So how does this compare with urban China? This is actually the comparison. You see that actually at the very top, China rejoins that global top 1%. Obviously, at every point, China is poorer, but the gaps are actually relatively small. You know, the median income person in China in the urban areas is at the 70th percentile in the world. And this is the graph for rural China. You see, there were really practically two countries. In rural China, you see that not everybody is worse off compared to the urban China, but you see that the median person in rural China is approximately at the median income level in the world. So that's an interesting kind of, how should I say, sort of a factoid to keep in mind, that the person who is at the median income level in rural China has an income level which is world median. India, how does it look? India urban. It's actually striking. India urban is below China rural, except to the very top where Indian top 10% are actually better off and even rejoin, you know, in the top 1% globally. And then, of course, very poor part of the world is rural India, that you notice actually rural India, the very poorest people in rural India are the bottom in global income distribution, and even all the way to the median, even the person with the median income in rural India is at the 20th percentile in the world. And then finally, this country is very interesting because it's a country where you would have people who are really at the bottom 10% in the world. You have the median person who is above the world median. You have a significant upper middle class. You notice that blue line actually going over the 90th global percentile. And you have people in the global 1%. And then countries like Brazil, that is here, and South Africa really mimic the world in the sense that they really cover practically the entire sort of spectrum of global income distribution, going really from the bottom through the middle and the upper middle class and reaching the top. So if you really want to see how does the world look in reality, you can basically say, okay, the world looks essentially like South Africa, but a little bit more unequal than South Africa. That's the sort of the current sort of shape of the world. And maybe I should stop
what
here.
What about Switzerland? What about Kuwait?
Oh, well, here is actually the comparison between Kuwait. I don't have the numbers actually, but here is the comparison between, that's when you mention Switzerland, here is the Netherlands, also another extremely rich country with relatively low income inequality. So even the poorest Dutch are relatively high up in the distribution. And as I was saying before, if you put them together with countries like in Africa, you basically have everybody in the Netherlands being richer, with the exception maybe at the very top of the African countries' income distributions. But even there, you know, you look at Madagascar, even the top 1% is poorer than the poorest people in the Netherlands. No, it doesn't mean that everybody that 1%, because obviously we are taking a sample. There are people in Madagascar who are definitely richer, but I'm saying statistically speaking, we don't have enough Malgashis who are actually rich to make the top 1% in their own country have a significantly high income. So that's, you know, yet another way to look at these large gaps which exist. And then to maybe my last point, maybe to raise the issue, how would global income inequality evolve in the future? Because while we are more or less, I think, certain that Asia will continue with its convergence and would continue reducing inequality, we are already at the point where China is no longer an inequality reducing country, because it has become sufficiently rich that now it is neither contributing nor reducing global inequality. Actually, it is beginning to add to global inequality. The country which is now crucial for the reduction is India, because it's still relatively poor and it's growing fast and it has many people. But as Africa actually overtakes in terms of population growth, the key question would become, is Africa going to converge? And if Africa does not converge, then we might really have this original graph that I've shown you, which looked optimistic, with the convergence and the decline in global inequality get reversed. And we could actually have another period of rising global inequality if indeed only Asia converges, but the continent with the highest growth rate of population, Africa, does not. So these are really, I think, the issues for this century that we will have to deal with. Is whether
Branko, this slide is also for 2013, 2014?
Yes, I think it is 2013, 2014.
Okay.
So, you know, so another way to look at it is the same slide is when you compare, when you talk about migration, when you compare countries like Morocco and France, you see the same sort of a story. If you're like a person at 20th percentile in Morocco, and then you go and end up at the same percentile in France, so you didn't get better off, relatively speaking, in your positioning, you have jumped over like whatever 40% of the world population in terms of income. So obviously it gives you huge incentive. So let me stop there. I would give this for people to read. I'm not going to talk about that, but this is really the most important probable future developments. I've already mentioned many of them, but they really have to deal with this continued reshuffling of world income distribution and the fact that rich people from the rich countries would gradually be some of them would be demoted from that very high position in the global income distribution. So I'll stop here.
Okay, guys, questions?
Yeah, I have one question. Where does Russia fit in, actually? I mean, I see Russia appear on the last line of the last slide, so I was kind of waiting for that.
Well, Russia, let me show you. Russia is actually very similar. I could almost do it together. Russia is very similar to China urban. So look at this slide. You see China urban, that's basically where Russia is. It has also top 1%. Again, we are not catching there, you know, billionaires, neither in China, nor in the US, nor in Russia, nor in any country. And to be quite honest, they really don't even matter because we are really looking at people. So even if you had, a couple of billionaires in terms of numbers of people, they will be small. But anyway, that's where Russia is in terms of the global income distribution. It's really like urban China.
So what are the lessons for Africa in order to be, Asia or China?
Well, this is the issue of growth. I mean, what propels growth, but what is, I think, interesting in studies of global inequality, because global inequality is being driven, as I've said in the very beginning, driven by two factors. One is growth rates of different countries, where actually you want to reduce, if you want to reduce global inequality, you want really poor countries and with lots of people to grow fast. And it's also driven by what happens to within national inequalities. So you are then actually led to the conclusion that for global inequality to go down, it's extremely important to have high growth for poor countries. So in other words, you start with something which looks like you're concerned with inequality, which in many people's mind is redistribution, but you really end up being concerned with growth, because growth is the most significant force for the reduction of global inequality. I mean, not any growth, but the growth of poor and populous countries. And so that's where Africa will fit in the future, but I don't know really what are the lessons in the sense, can Africa replicate Asia? That's, I think it's a different, it's not really a question for me. So, that's a different question.
Do you find that income inequality goes up at the beginning and then eventually it will be reduced once the country is making more money and so on and so on?
You can see that first graph, you remember that first graph, which looks very much like an inverted U. You can see it, and some kind of people have mentioned that, some kind of a global Kuznets curve, Yeah. And, if you want also to have an idea, obviously that's kind of slightly utopic, but let's have it's useful to have this endpoint idea. The endpoint idea, which I suppose we're talking about 3 centuries hence, is the idea of really small differences in between country incomes. If the world were to become like one nation, let's suppose like the United States, there are many things which would change. First, because of free movement of labor, the differences and capital, the differences between different states in the US have declined, over the last 50 years. And the differences between mean incomes in the world in that same optic should decline. Like also, you have seen that in the European Union with the convergence of first the Southern countries and then East European countries. So we might actually sort of envisage a world where the between component, or let me put it like this component becomes much smaller. But that does not mean that the within component, which means the component of inequalities within nation states, would necessarily go down. So you might envisage the world where actually differences between countries are like in Western Europe or European Union, relatively small, but within each of them, you might have significant cleavages. So that's a possibility, and that would be a good development in the sense that, it would mean that Africa has to some extent caught up with rich world.
Okay, good. Emmanuel, go ahead. Questions? Emmanuel.
Yes, I have a question because, Branko, you explained that the decline in global income inequality between 2008 and 2013 can be fundamentally attributed to the peculiar situation in Asia, where income inequality diminished. At the same time, the mean income increased in about 50%, right? So as a result of this, the relative position of Asia changed with respect to other regions, implying a convergence between regions.
Right.
This phenomenon also impacted on the increasing overlap component of the Gini?
Yeah, well, the Gini has 3 components. It has the between component, within component, and I often don't want to talk about overlap because it confuses people. But when you have a convergence between countries' incomes, I mean, if you remember that graph with graphs that actually start converging with each other, you have a larger overlap component. So as I mentioned before, if you were to plot together Germany and France as two distributions, they would be practically, you would not be able to see practically the difference between the two of them. So the overlap component does, by definition, actually increase as there is a convergence. I prefer in my talks to call it like to put it together with the within component, because the within and the overlap go together. But yes, to answer to your question, yes, with convergence, the overlap component goes up.
Thank you. And you mentioned also that Brazil and Mexico were among the giants country where the income distribution remained rather stable
yes.
in the immediate period after the financial crisis. And given that Professor Weiberger mentioned Russia, I wonder if there are, if you would like to describe another giant that you didn't put on the graph, like could be
yes.
Africa, Indonesia.
Yeah, I did not actually, of course, have the time to go through what happened to within national inequalities. That's really a big topic, and it's quite interesting. But okay, let me put it like this: the basic story between 2008 2013, not much happened to within national inequalities. There was no systemic movement towards higher inequality nor towards lower inequality. These are actually here Gini coefficients in 2008 and 2013. I'm sorry, I should actually do that. I'm going to put the names of the countries there. But for example, you see the top one is South Africa. It went down slightly. So the very high inequality countries generally tended to become slightly less unequal, which meant basically that Brazil, for example, became less unequal, Mexico likewise, and generally Latin America, until the very recent period, became less unequal and actually bucked the trend, because most of the countries over the last 30 years became more unequal. Now, two other giants, South Africa, extremely unequal country, the most unequal in the world. South Africa actually became now more unequal than during apartheid. We are talking about the Gini coefficient, which is about 66. It's really 66, 67, just below 70, very, very high. Russia is actually a country with a declining inequality, not significantly, but still declining. So the overall Gini is around 40. So we don't have many changes in inequality in Russia. It's similar to inequality, I think a little bit lower than inequality in China. And both Russia and China inequality are on the declining portion in the last 10 years. For China, very clearly so, because we see that also in the wage data. Chinese low skill wages are increasing faster than high skill wages. In other words, China has come to a position where you cannot have this, infinite supplies of labor from rural areas at a given wage rate. So this is what we have seen in Russia and China. And India is an interesting case. I didn't speak about that, but India, we used to have only consumption data for the last 60 years. By consumption, India has relatively low Gini, but more recently we had income data. And India really looks very much like Latin American countries, with high inequality, Gini over 50, and even the structure. That's another paper that I'm just doing now. The structure of between capital income and labor income is very similar to Latin American countries. So I would really see India as practically Latin American country. Unfortunately, as I said, we don't have the Indian data on income over the longer term. And so we cannot really say how India was in 1960s. We have consumption data, which are, of course, not showing you as high inequality, because at the very top, the rich people saved, so they don't show up as such huge consumers as they do in income data.
Branko, do you see that former communist countries have less inequality versus countries that were controlled by the British or the French, and whether the French were more terrible than the British or vice versa?
I cannot, I mean, that can be studied. I have not studied it actually. So the different role of different colonies, I cannot tell you.
Is it worth a PhD thesis from someone in the program? Do you recommend it?
I think it's a good idea. You know, I've seen studies of how colonial institutions, you must know that colonial institutions had an impact on growth. So there are studies of that, but there are no studies that I've seen of colonial institutions on inequality. It's a good topic. It's actually a very good topic. I mean, take African countries, they're not all the same, you know, in terms of inequality.
Yeah, right. My impression is that communist country, because they teach you how to read and write, and healthcare is more or less okay, you are in better off than the British, who try to rule through producing very small elite, like in India or in any other countries that they control in Africa. And I don't know enough about the French, but it seems to me similar in Senegal.
No, it's very
Mali.
interesting. Yeah, very interesting topic actually. But for communist countries, former communist, I can tell you, I don't have the slide here, but there is a very nice slide. Still, you know, most of these countries, despite the fact that Russia is unequal, and of course is in the people's mind as heavily unequal, which is true, other countries are not at all. Actually, Central European countries, like I'll just go by name now, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovenia, are Poland. Among the, but Poland is a little bit more unequal, because, but these countries are actually among the most equal countries in the world. So if you then plot kind of a line, you see still the, not still, but you see now these Central European and some East European countries being definitely below the OECD average. So they are really, they have increased inequality compared to what it was. I had a Czech friend who was a sociologist who actually had kind of nice papers in the 1980s. What he did, he would actually explain, do a regression, explain the entire inequality. Czechoslovakia was always very equal. So explain the entire inequality simply by demographic factors. So he would just enter your age, your gender, and your education, and then basically explain the entire inequality. So it was a very, you know, obviously a country very equal, and it remained pretty equal. I wanted to show this stuff before. Previous question was about China and Russia. So this is actually the Chinese, the blue dots are Chinese official Gini estimates. You notice that actually it's very high. US is at 41, 42. China is almost at 50 official. And you see, however, a small decline since whatever it's 2010. But anyway, there are other questions, so I don't want to take all the time.
Okay, well, Dawa, do you have questions? Dawa? I don't see you, so you have a background. Dawa? No. Emmanuel, do you have more questions?
There's a question from someone from the public. Kevin says, or asks, it's too late for countries like Brazil to try the catching up model of Asia? I think Kevin is referring to the changes in China.
Yeah, I'm not sure what it means. Is it too late? You know, I mean, that is Brazil much more developed now than China was in 1978? Yes, of course. So I'm not sure what it means too late, you know.
Okay, anyone else? Questions?
Professor, I want to ask about, could you go back to the comparison with like the population live like behind 1 century ago?
Yes, okay.
Yeah, I'm thinking, would the comparison with world's average per capita GDP will be more interesting in this scenario? Because I think like the richest countries per capita GDP is not monotonic increasing across the year. It's like from time to time, maybe in this period, like the the richest country is not higher than the previous period.
No, it is monotonically increasing. I mean, I see your point, but no, it's monotonically increasing. There was no, I mean, what you mean is that actually could at some point the richest country become less rich than the previous richest country. It could be the US when during the US was the richest country in 1929, but then it went down by 1933. So in that sense, yes, there were some episodes like that, but we are talking here about 50 or 100 years. England in, England in 1920 was definitely richer than Australia in 1820. So, you know, there is no doubt. So don't overdo this graph. It is simply an idea, simply to show you that the things are not so rosy as some people argue by just looking at the means. So in other words, you have to go a little bit above the means. But I think that it's a good question about being monotonic, but I think actually that the richest country, with some exception, maybe as I said, the US 29-33, there was a monotonic increase. But it's also difficult, like for example, probably now among largest countries, leaving aside countries like, you know, Kuwait, but probably now we would have like Switzerland and the Netherlands and Luxembourg, but Luxembourg is a small country. So if Luxembourg, for example, has a decline, which it would have now with COVID, yes, it would not be monotonic.
Yeah. And yeah, what about the comparing with the mean of the GDP per capita of the world? It's like at least I'm living as the mean like a century years ago.
Oh yes, you can do that. Of course, we have the mean of the world. Yes, we have the mean of the GDP per capita, and you can actually find how many countries are below that mean. Yeah, you can do it. Yeah.
Yep. Thank you.
You get strange results that during war inequality is going down, right?
Well, that's the big topic. No, let me just put it like that. There is no, I think, doubt that during most wars, inequality went down, but not always. And it went down because you had physical destruction of assets, you had increased taxation to pay for the war, you have often hyperinflation, which affects the creditors. You know, there were like several recent papers which leave no doubt. For example, for the UK, World War I, very significant decline. Actually, you know, the highest inequality, for example, in wealth ownership in the UK was before World War I. 70% of wealth was owned by the top 1%. That has never happened again. But you have also very interesting recent studies which corroborate what was written in historical books, that Germany between 1914 and 1918 had an increase in inequality. And it's really related to the unwillingness and political power of the landed elite, which did not want to be taxed. And so that's interesting. You have actually a paper that shows you exactly the opposite development in the UK between 14 and 1918 with the decline of inequality, and in Germany between the same period with an increase. So that's but you know, depends whether you have the war in your own territory. You know, it's also, although US didn't have the war in its own territory, but actually had a decline in inequality.
I have a question that is related to Professor Wim's question. You have some data about taxes, so you can measure inequality before and after taxes. Is it really working?
Yes, you can.
Is it really reducing or not, and so on and so on?
No, you can actually, for practical, for example, look at LIS. LIS has 60 countries, and you can measure, and we have measured that, market income inequality, inequality before taxes or after taxes. So you can do that, and you know, you see, I don't have it here, but of course you, maybe I do, well, no. I can show you, for example, for individual countries, you have marked differences. For example, if you compare Germany and the US, you see that German redistributory function was much greater not surprisingly, much greater than the US.
Right, but I mean within a country, and I
within
think
the country, within
a country, and
yeah.
Also maybe as a growth that you need to measure is like 5 years later or something. So maybe there is a delay. The taxes today and the effect on income inequality is coming later on or something.
Yeah, but what you see actually in contemporaneous data is you see, for example, market income inequality. Yes, well, to some extent it's shown even in this graph. So I'll explain that in a minute. But market income inequality in the US and let's say Germany is about the same. It's about the Gini 55. But the disposable, which means after-tax income inequality, in Germany is 35 and in the US is 41. The reason is that German system of transfers is bigger. I'm not sure it's more targeted, but at least it's bigger, and tax system is more progressive. So that's why the reduction between the market income inequality and disposable income inequality is higher in Germany than in the US. This graph is only market income, your capital income, and your labor income. So what it shows you is that capital income Gini, which is on the vertical axis always, shows you much higher inequality. It is much more unequally distributed than labor income. Labor income is red or orange. So it is actually has a very high Gini of 0.5, but compared to capital income, it's low because capital income is very, very concentrated and you have the Gini of 0.9 or 90. So that's the case in all countries. You know, Norway or Sweden, you know, they have this reputation of egalitarian countries, but when it comes to capital income, they are as inegalitarian as the US. So in other words, you know, we can study all of these different inequalities by different factors or at different stages of the redistribution. So these data in that respect are really excellent. You have 60 plus countries, and I think now we have about 600 surveys or so.
Do you find that the variance for the capital Gini is much higher than the variance for the labor, or from this?
Oh, yes, yes, sir.
Yes?
Always. You see the blue line, the blue dots, yes. They are always high. There is absolutely no way that they would not be. And the reason is that actually most people do not have any capital income. So when you look at inequality, they all come with zeros, you know, and then you calculate inequality across such zeros, then of course that pushes the Gini coefficient up. But not that many people have zero for labor income.
I was thinking that if you have if you own capital, you are open to more risk, and as a result, maybe you deserve more inequality in some respect, or it produces inequality.
Well, we don't do here who is deserving what, but we just do the fact that actually, you know, capital historically has been much more concentrated. And owners of capital historically have been richer than owners of labor force only. And when you look at today's distributions, the share of capital in your income as a percentage is almost monotonically increasing with your income position. So people who are in the top 5%, they have a much higher share of capital income than people who are, let's suppose, at the median or the 60th percentile and so on. So this is a kind of a regularity which is, you know, which is true for every country practically.
Good. Emmanuel, more questions?
I actually had a question.
Go ahead.
So in the Lechner paper that the two of you wrote, you talk about doing this analysis where every person is equally weighted. And that's a more cosmopolitan view, definitely fits in with international agencies and sort of their mandates. And you talk about the convergence of economies, in particular, probably China with the West and India later. And I'm just wondering, what do you think the timeline for something like that is?
What do you mean? What is the timeline?
If I wanted to look at the point in history where the income distributions are the same? I know that's a tough question, and that sort of prognostication isn't easy, but if you had to, shoot from the hip.
Income distributions. Well, yeah. I don't know. Well, I can more easily shoot from the hip if you ask me, when do I think that actually per capita incomes might converge?
Okay.
I could say Africa, if it starts growing at the Asian rates, which will be very difficult because, Africa will have 2.5% population growth rate, and that does already. And then in order to really catch up, you need per capita growth. China had like 7% per capita growth, but then Africa would need to have, let's suppose, 6. So that means that you would have growth rate of 8.5. That's very, very hard to achieve, but let's suppose they do. Well, then you might see like convergence you have to calculate, but I think a century from now. So it's not going to happen like, tomorrow. But convergence of income distributions is a different story, In the first case, it's a convergence to be statistically, minded. It's a convergence of the first moment of the distribution. In the second case, it's a convergence of the second moment of distribution. It's actually much harder than the convergence of the first.
Absolutely, yeah, I misspoke. Per capita is probably.
Yeah, per capita is. But anyway, so maybe other questions. I don't want to go into this.
Okay.
Branko, I have a question to you about demography and your results. In other words, maybe countries with younger population, you should expect to find more inequality. And as the population mature, that's what you find?
No, there is actually, I didn't look at that because normally the people don't, but it is true actually. When you have younger population, there is a certain demographic effect of inequality. I mean, take Africa. You have lots of young population who are basically under, let's suppose, 14 years of age. Nobody works by definition. So, and they are counted, they are part of the family and you actually count them. So yes, in principle, more younger populations could have higher inequality on the basis of simply having larger share of the population outside of labor force.
And as a result, we should not feel so, terrible about these countries because this inequality, I assume, is raising growth, is raising, people are taking risk, to invest, and some of them are. See what I'm going to?
But I know where you're going, but that's a very, very tricky, very slippery slope where you're going because the assumption that inequality is good for growth is, this is a whole, 200 years of
for a young
discussion
population. So for a young population, I don't know, in Tunisia, all of these countries where, the Arab Spring or whatever, all of these young people suddenly are going to work and suddenly are, competing. Maybe that's what happened with China in 1978, 1980, when markets started to open. If you look at the Chinese today, they are very young, all of those rich guys.
No, they're young in terms, you mean young in terms of age, yes.
Yes.
Well, but the rich guys in the US are young too, if you look at, people, I don't think there is a difference in so much in age,
I see.
Between Jack Ma and Zuckerberg and others, they're relatively young. But China is a young, wealthy nation in the following sense, which I didn't discuss today, is in the ratio between wealth and income. Normally, the richer you become as a country, that ratio goes up because you accumulate lots of wealth. Excuse me. An outlier, for example, is Italy. Italy is, of course, a rich country. But when you look at Italian wealth, it's sort of disproportionately wealthy because, of course, Italy has been accumulating wealth and did not have devastating wars on its territory for, accumulation of wealth went on for, 20 centuries. On the other hand, when you look at China and India, they have lower wealth, particularly China, lower wealth compared to what you would expect based on their income. Why? Because most recently, their Chinese income has expanded, but it did not have the time to accumulate sufficiently. So obviously that is going to change in the years to come. So the ratio between wealth and income in China is going to catch up. So that's where you see kind of young, wealthy countries.
Do they impute housing services like rent?
In principle, yes. Well, not land, but housing, because this is actually from the point of view of welfare. So yes, you're imputing, in principle, not that every household, that every survey does, but in principle, and actually in list data, you impute the services of housing that you own.
Because I'm thinking about the price of land that is going up and so on, in urban areas.
Yeah, well, the price, that's actually, price of land going up is changing your wealth or your asset position. Excuse me, but unless you have something from that in your income, you would not see it. For example, I'm sitting now in this house, and this house might have doubled in price. I'm going to see it in my household survey only because the imputed rent on this house has doubled. But, and of course I become wealthier, but that is the wealth part, which is by definition different from the income part.
Right, but if you rent, right, if you have commercial properties in the cities, then it will show up in the rent. And
yeah, it would show up. For example, if you rent, that would show up because your income would. Right. You're a renter. It's like you're having higher interest or dividend. It will show up.
Right. Yes. Okay, guys, more questions. Dawa, I'm looking at Emmanuel. Who was the other student who was supposed to ask questions?
Well, Emmanuel had lots of questions yesterday.
Yes.
What happened to them? There were 8 of them. I replied, but very briefly. So maybe you can have one more because we're almost finished now.
Emmanuel.
I have a question.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Question from the group of the students. One question is, China grew up with a globalization, and nowadays there are like different trends, anti-globalization, like a Brexit. Do you believe those trends may affect to the global inequality?
Could you repeat your question, because I'm not sure we all understand what.
No, let me repeat. I think I got it. Actually, whether deglobalization, potential deglobalization, might add to global inequality. Is this a question?
Yes, correct.
I don't know. It's really kind of, I can speculate on that, but anybody can speculate. I really, it's a very difficult question to answer. I mean, it's, the thing is, sorry, the thing to understand is when you work with the data, so many data, big questions like that are really not answerable. Because first one has to define what is deglobalization. Is it like less trade between the US and China, less outsourcing, less sort of outsourcing in Asia, in Laos, Burma, anywhere. Secondly, you have then to think, how would it affect each individual country in terms of its growth rate and in terms of its income distribution? So maybe Vietnam might gain because more foreign investment will go to Vietnam. But is this going to be a more important effect than China losing, let's suppose? So it is not a question that honestly is answerable in such a big, how should I say, in such a big, it's too big a question to be answered.
Okay, Branko, I have a question about immigration. So people left Ukraine, let's say, or Russia.
Right.
So as a result, you should expect inequality in Russia and in Ukraine to go down because the people who leave are usually more whatever.
Could be, I don't know really, because I don't know. We don't know.
But in your data, you can test it, right?
Well, because no, how can I test it? I don't have the data.
Look at the look at the inequality in Russia before and after the migration, or in Ukraine is better.
Yes, but you know, you have, I mean, Russia inequality changes for hundreds of other reasons, you know, changes because, you know, you have sanctions, changes because you have declining price of oil, changes because you have the government policy which increases rate of interest. I mean, so the myriads of things. You know, the only way is you have had studies, for example, the effect of remittances on inequality. That's doable. And that was done many years ago, started with the effect of remittances, of Mexican remittances. That can be done actually, and remittances have become really a very large source of income. Like Moldova, I think, has like 20% of GDP in remittances. So that can be studied, but whether, you know, losing people, you can actually argue that losing people with high human capital is a loss in terms of growth. But, you know, I'm not really sure, you know, how to do that in terms of inequality. It's too complicated. But for growth, people have been arguing that actually you essentially have with immigration for the emitting country, you have two effects. One effect is loss of some skill level, which you have funded or financed to acquire, for that person to acquire, versus the remittance inflow. So that's basically a trade-off. The problem is that the remittance inflow is not something that we know that it does not continue forever. You know, it's maybe strong in the beginning and then gradually evaporates.
Okay, I see. So time is up. Is Christos around? Maybe you want
I'm around. I'm here.
Go ahead, Christos.
Of course. Branko, it was a pleasure to have you with us. We thank you for visiting us and delivering such an illuminating talk on inequality. Definitely for me, and I think for all the present. And we hope to have you again with us soon.
Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Hope you guys, you know, enjoyed at least some parts of it. And some of you I will see, well, tomorrow evening in my usual class. But for the others, I hope to see you soon when we are both back after this disaster and we can meet in person.
So Branko, you can send me like 2 or 3 topics for our PhD students that they may be working with the data, with the Luxembourg data,
yes.
Your data.
Yes, I could send you that. I actually like, I have to say, I like this colonial origin and inequality, the one that you suggested. So I'm going to repeat that. I think nobody has studied that really. It's very interesting, you know. Is Mali different from Ghana, for example? You know, things like that. Yeah.
Okay, good. We can cooperate. Anyone else before we leave? I don't want to call names because I don't want to put you on the spot. But okay, in this case, Branko, again, thank you very much, and hopefully we'll see you more. And hopefully you will come to our seminars in the future. Next week, we have Lars Hansen. His paper will be on Thursday. And Lars is a genius. He studied above me 2 or 3 years above me at the University of Minnesota, a student of Chris Sims, who also got a Nobel. And Lars is a character. So I suggest all of you to know more of him next week. Again, he's working on the paper as we are talking. So by Thursday, he promised me that he will give me the draft that he is producing. So I appreciate everyone and thank you. And I want to thank Christine and I want to thank Christos for all their help in putting this up. Thank you and have a nice.
Thank you, Branko. It was great having you.
Thank you very much, guys. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Sure.